The snow came early that year, and it came without mercy. Sarah Whitfield stood in the doorway of the small church hall in Cedar Ridge, Montana, holding her daughter's hand so tight the little girl winced. 6 months a widow. 6 months since the fever took her husband, Daniel, in the middle of a spring that should have brought them their first real harvest. 6 months of watching the money run out, watching the neighbors grow tired of feeding a woman and a child who could offer nothing back. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know who's sitting with me tonight for this story. Sarah was 28 years old, and she felt 60. Her hands were cracked from washing other people's linens for pennies. Her daughter, Rose, was 4, thin as a reed, with eyes too old for her face. They had one trunk left. Everything else had been sold, piece by piece, just to keep bread on the table through the fall. "We can't stay another night at the boarding house," the landlady had told her that morning, not unkindly, but firmly. "I've got a family coming in with cash in hand." "I'm sorry, Sarah. I truly am." So there she stood, in the church hall, at the town's monthly gathering, where the widows and the desperate came looking for work, for charity, for anything. She wasn't looking for a husband. She had loved one man in her life and buried him with her whole heart still wrapped around his name. She was looking for a roof. Just a roof, and enough food to keep her daughter's cheeks from going hollow. That was when she heard his voice. "Ma'am." Low, rough, careful, like a man not used to speaking to strangers. "I heard you can cook." She turned and found herself looking up at a mountain of a man. Broad shoulders wrapped in a canvas coat gone soft with wear, a hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate, a jaw that hadn't smiled in what looked like years. His hands, when she noticed them, were scarred and enormous, a rancher's hands, hands that had pulled calves from mud and mended 100 miles of fence. "I can," she said carefully. "Who's asking?" "Name's Wyatt Calloway. I run cattle out past the North Ridge. Lost my cook 2 weeks back to a marriage in Bozeman, and winter's coming faster than I can handle alone." He paused, and something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like shame at having to ask. "Can you cook for 2? Rose tugged at her mother's skirt and looked up at the tall stranger without fear, the way only children can look at danger and see none of it. Sarah's throat tightened. 2. Not 1. He meant her and the child both. "I have a daughter," she said, testing him, half expecting the same look she'd gotten from every other man in town, the look that said a widow with a child was a burden, not a blessing. But Wyatt Calloway only nodded, slow and steady, like she'd told him something ordinary. "I got 2 hands and a whole lot of empty rooms. Winter's no place for a little one without walls around her." He crouched down, careful and unhurried, so he was closer to Rose's height. "You like chickens, little miss?" Rose nodded shyly, one thumb creeping toward her mouth. "Got about 30 of them causing trouble on my land. Could use someone to help me keep an eye on them." It wasn't charity, the way he said it. It was work. It was purpose. And for a woman who had been handed pity after pity since Daniel died, being offered a job instead of sympathy nearly broke her composure right there in the church hall. "I'll pay fair wages," Wyatt added, straightening back up. "Room, board, and pay at the end of each month. My place is 3 hours out. I understand if that's too far, or too much to ask of a woman alone." Sarah looked down at her daughter's thin face, then back up at this stranger who had somehow, in the space of 2 minutes, offered her the first real chance she'd had in half a year. "We'll come," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. Something eased in his shoulders, just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying a long while. They left the next morning before the sun was fully up, the wagon loaded with what little they owned. Rose fell asleep against her mother's side within the first hour, and Sarah watched the frost-covered fields roll by, wondering what kind of man drove 3 hours into town just to ask a stranger if she could cook. The Calloway Ranch, when they finally reached it, sat nestled against the base of the mountains, a sprawling house of good timber with smoke curling from the chimney and cattle scattered like dark stones across white fields. It was bigger than anything Sarah had imagined, and lonelier too. No woman's touch anywhere. Curtains gone gray with dust. A kitchen that looked like it hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. "My wife passed 4 years back," Wyatt said quietly, watching her take it all in. "Winter fever, same as took a lot of folks that year. Never had the heart to change much after." Sarah understood grief. She understood it in her bones. She said nothing, only nodded, and that nod seemed to tell him more than words could have. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both seemed grateful for. Sarah cooked, and cooked well, filling the house with the smell of fresh bread and simmering stew for the first time in years. Wyatt worked from before dawn until after dark, but he always came in for supper, always thanked her plainly, always made sure Rose had the biggest piece of cornbread. He was a quiet man. Not cold, just careful, like someone who had learned that words could be used against him and preferred to let his actions speak instead. Sarah noticed things. She noticed how he fixed the loose step on the porch without being asked, how he brought in extra firewood and stacked it by her door before the cold set in, how he never once raised his voice, not even when a horse spooked and nearly threw him into the fence. And she noticed how he was with Rose. It started small. He'd let her ride along on his knee when he checked the herd close to the house. He'd whittle little wooden animals for her at night by the fire, quiet and patient, his big hands working slow and gentle over small pieces of wood. He never pushed, never forced affection, just left the door open and let her walk through it in her own time. By the second month, Rose was calling him Mr. Wyatt with the kind of trust that made Sarah's chest ache with something she didn't have a name for yet. If this story is warming something in you already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there is so much more of this waiting for you, and I would love for you to stay through to the end. The trouble started with the fence line. Wyatt's land bordered the Halloran spread, and old man Halloran had been trying to buy out the north pasture for 2 years, ever since Wyatt's wife passed and folks in town began whispering that a widower alone couldn't hold on to good grazing land forever. Halloran wasn't a patient man, and when Wyatt refused to sell again that November, cattle started turning up on the wrong side of broken fences. Then came the fire. It happened on a night the wind was fierce enough to rattle the windows, a night Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. She woke to the smell of smoke and Rose's frightened cry, and when she ran to the window, she saw flames climbing along the edge of the hay barn, orange and furious against the black sky. Wyatt was already outside, shouting for the hands, throwing buckets of snow and water at the base of the fire with a desperation Sarah had never seen in him. She grabbed Rose, wrapped her in every blanket she could find, and ran out into the cold to help, because there was no version of that night where she stood by and did nothing. They fought that fire for hours. Sarah hauled water until her arms went numb. Rose sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, crying, watching the only home she'd known in months threaten to burn to ash. By the time the flames finally died, the barn was half gone, but the house stood, and so did the herd, saved by inches and exhaustion. Wyatt collapsed onto the porch steps afterward, soot streaked across his face, hands blistered and raw. Sarah sat beside him without thinking, without asking permission, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "Halloran's boys did this," Wyatt finally said, voice rough with smoke and fury. "I know it in my bones, even if I can't prove it. Why does he want your land so badly? Water rights. My pasture sits over the best spring for 20 miles. Man's been trying to choke me off it for years, ever since my wife died, and he figured I'd break easy." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his slate-gray eyes cracked open just slightly. "I almost did break, Sarah. Before you came." It was the first time he'd said her name like that, soft, like it mattered. "You don't seem like a man who breaks easy," she said quietly. "I had nothing left to fight for. Just me and cattle and an empty house." He looked toward the window where Rose had fallen asleep against the glass, still watching for him. Now I got a reason to get up every morning that isn't just chores. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. Wyatt, I need to tell you something. I didn't come here looking for anything more than work. I loved my husband. I still love him. I wasn't looking to feel anything like this again. I'm not asking you to stop loving him, Wyatt said gently. Man like that, giving you a daughter like Rose, he deserves to be loved forever. I'm just asking if there's room enough in that heart for something new to grow alongside it. I'm not in a hurry, Sarah. I've waited 4 years already. I can wait as long as you need. There was no kiss that night, no grand declaration. Just two tired, soot-covered people sitting on a porch step in the cold, closer than they'd ever been, watching the last embers of the barn fire die into gray smoke against the stars. But something had shifted, quiet and permanent, like the first thaw of spring beneath still frozen ground. Winter deepened after that, and so did the danger. Halloran grew bolder, his men riding the fence lines at night, and one morning Wyatt found 3 of his best cattle dead in the north pasture, poisoned, their bodies stiff in the frost. He rode into town white with rage and came back 3 hours later, quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that worried Sarah more than shouting would have. I confronted him, Wyatt said, sitting heavy at the kitchen table while Sarah set a bowl of stew in front of him. Told him straight out what I knew. He laughed in my face. Said a widower with no wife and no sons would lose that land within the year, one way or another, whether I sold it or not. Sarah sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee to keep them from shaking. Then let him be wrong. Wyatt looked up at her, surprised. You're not alone anymore, Wyatt. You have hands who are loyal to you. You have a herd that survived a fire. And you have. She hesitated, then pushed forward anyway, because some things needed saying out loud. You have me. And Rose. If you'll have us, truly have us, not just as a cook and a chore, but as family, then Halloran can ride his fence lines until doomsday. He won't win against people who love this land, and each other, more than he ever could. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was holding back something enormous. Sarah, he said finally, voice thick, I have loved you since the second week you were here, watching you carry water for a fire that wasn't even your responsibility to fight. I have loved you since I watched you teach Rose her letters by the fire every night after a full day's work, never once complaining, never once acting like this was anything less than a full life. I didn't say anything because I was scared. Scared you'd leave the second something better came along, same as everyone in this valley believes will happen to a man alone with no wife to keep him steady. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah whispered, tears finally spilling over. I haven't been going anywhere for weeks now. I just didn't know how to say it. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, careful, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. Marry me, Sarah. Not because you need a roof, not because Rose needs a home, though heaven knows I want to give you both of those forever. Marry me because I want to spend every winter of my life sitting across this table from you. Marry me because that little girl in the next room has started calling me Papa when she thinks I can't hear her, and I have never wanted anything so much in my whole life as I want to earn that word properly. Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound cracking open something that had been sealed shut in her chest since the day Daniel died. Yes, she said. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in the spring, in the same small church hall where he'd first asked if she could cook for 2. The whole valley came, even some of Halloran's own ranch hands, who had grown tired of a boss who poisoned cattle and burned barns over greed. Halloran himself left the county not long after, his schemes exposed, his reputation ruined, unable to stand against a man who had turned out to have far more allies than enemies once folks saw the truth of what kind of man Wyatt Calloway really was. Rose stood at the front of that church in a new blue dress Sarah had sewn by candlelight, holding a small basket of wildflowers, beaming up at the 2 people who had built her a home out of nothing but kindness and time. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wyatt knelt down first, before he even kissed his bride, and pulled Rose into a hug so full of tenderness that half the church wiped away tears. "You're my daughter now," he told her, voice thick. "Not because the law says so. Because I choose you. Every single day, for the rest of my life, I choose you." Rose threw her small arms around his neck and said the words she'd been practicing in secret for weeks. "I love you, Papa." That night, back at the ranch, with the new barn rebuilt stronger than the old one and the herd grown fat and healthy through a hard winter survived together, Sarah stood on the porch and watched her husband carry their sleeping daughter inside, humming some old tune under his breath, gentle as falling snow. She thought of Daniel then, and felt no guilt in the thinking, only gratitude, because somewhere out past the stars she believed he was glad that his girls had found a home, glad that a quiet, broken rancher and a tired, grieving widow had found each other in a church hall on the coldest night of the year and built something neither of them thought they deserved anymore. A family. A home. A love that had grown slow and steady as the seasons, rooted deep enough to weather any storm that came for it. If this story touched your heart even a little, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what part of Sarah and Wyatt's story stayed with you the longest. Share this with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories just like this one, because there is always another home waiting to be found, another family waiting to be built, one quiet act of kindness at a time.